everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of All About African Violets. I'm Annie, your host, and I welcome you to this very first episode. I'm really excited to be doing this podcast, and I hope that you will come back week after week and tell your friends, and we'll have a lot of fun, and we'll learn something in the process. I'll tell you, I guess to start, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is actually Adrienne, but everybody calls me Annie. If you met me in the African Violet world, you probably call me Annie. That stems from, my first foray into being online, back on America Online. And I've been growing violets since the mid-90s, and that's about when, things started to happen on the internet. And back in the day, we were all told that you should never use your real name in a chat room because, there could be an ex-murderer in there. And so I ended up with Annie 97. I'm not quite sure how, it just seemed to be the way to go. And I met a lot of people in the African Violet world online. And then once we met in person, they just never could call me anything except Annie, and so they introduced me to more people as Annie, and I just became Annie. So I am, I said I've been growing violets since the mid-90s, I guess. I'm a life member of the African Violet Society of America. I'm also a senior judge for the AVSA. That's the acronym for African Violet Society of America. You'll hear me say that a lot. I am also a past member of the Hoosier African Violet Society in Crown Point, Indiana, and a past member of the Ventura County African Violet Society in Ventura, California. I am a member of the Illinois State African Violet Society, and I am their newsletter editor, and I'm also a member of the Missouri Valley African Violet Council. And that's a regional organization that encompasses a number of states all along the Missouri River. So I've been growing violets for a long time, and I really love them. They are really one of America's, probably the world's favorite blooming houseplants, and they have an undeserved reputation as being difficult to grow. They are not hard to grow, and we're going to talk about that in this podcast in the coming weeks. So, but why now? I guess a couple of people have asked me that already. Why are you doing this, and why are you doing it now? Well, the reason I'm doing it now is that I'm starting over. Even experienced growers sometimes make mistakes, and I made a mistake, and I ended up losing all of my plants. So I just went to the national convention. There's a convention for everything, including African violets. And the national convention this year was in Detroit. It was in early June. And the night before I left, I had ramped up last year and bought leaves and plantlets with the express purpose of having plants to take to show, because Detroit is not that far from me. I'm in the Chicagoland area, and I could drive. So I ramped way up. I had probably, at one point, about 150 varieties. I don't know if you just saw that flash. We're having a thunderstorm here in Chicagoland. It's been so hot this weekend. And now we're having a thunderstorm, which has cooled everything off about 20 degrees, and the rain is much needed. So you can see out the back there. We're in my sunroom, and you can see some plants hanging. There's a wandering Jew behind me, and a spider plant, and you can see my deck with my hammock, and it's wet out there. But this is a place where I spend a lot of my time. So welcome to my sunroom. That's actually one of the segments of the podcast, Welcome to My Sunroom. Anyway, I love violets, and I really wanted to start this podcast now because, as I said, I'm starting over. And I thought it could be a great tool for people who, not only me, but if you're starting, or you just have an interest, or you want to learn along the way, I welcome you to be here with me every week on this journey, and we'll be looking at my plants and how I'm starting over and how that works. I would like to tell you a couple of other things quickly. All About African Violets is musically sponsored by Ted Yoder. He is the 2010 National Hammer Dulcimer Champion, and he makes some pretty awesome music, and I'm thrilled to have his music on the podcast. You can hear it at the beginning and at the end of the podcast, and I just want to be sure to mention that to you. And as I said, I did lose all my plants, so we're going to be talking about that. But right now I'm going to move to the next section of the podcast, and it is called Tips and Treasures. And I have some tips for you today. I probably don't have any treasures because I believe that the treasures will be the people that I'm very hopeful to have on the podcast with me in the coming weeks and months as interviewees, and to come and talk to you about African violets and how they grow them and what they do and how it works for them. So those will be your treasures. But in the meantime, I do have a few tips. And the first one I want to tell you about is something that I found. And actually, you know what? I should probably tell you how I started growing violets. That might be something you want to know. My first foray into growing an African violet was in college, back in the day. And I was given a leaf, and I read a book about how to put this leaf down so that it would propagate. And and I have a really green thumb. I mean, as you can see, there's plants above me. There's a plant over, actually that way. Another plant. There's plants everywhere in the sunroom. But I put this leaf down, and it rotted. And I thought, well, that's bothersome. And I didn't really think that much about it. And then I was gifted an African violet, and it was beautiful, and it bloomed on my desk, and at work, and I loved it. And then I was moving overseas, and I couldn't take plants with me overseas, and I'd had it for a while, and I never could get it to bloom again. And I thought, well, what's up with that? Once again, I'm thinking, I have a pretty green thumb. I don't understand why this isn't blooming. But I was leaving, and I gave it to a friend of mine, and I asked her, years later, I said, did you ever get that violet to bloom for you again? And she said, oh, sure. And I thought, oh, well, this just cannot be rocket science. I don't understand why I'm having such a hard time. So the third time, as they say, was the charm. I was shopping. I was at the Jewel, which is, it's the thunder. Can you hear the thunder from the storm? I was at the Jewel, and they often had African violets at the Jewel. And I brought 3 of them home. So rescue mission to the Jewel. I brought 3 African violets home. And I had great exposure in my apartment at the time, in my studio. I had bright light, and it was a southwestern exposure, which is a kind of a really strong exposure in the sunlight. But I had lace curtains, so that was just enough that the plants grew and they bloomed, and I thought, well, gee, see, I can grow these things. And then I discovered the African Violet Society of America. So you remember I mentioned that when I first started growing, it was the mid-90s or so, around 95, 97, somewhere around there. And the internet, I was just discovering it myself and out there looking for things, looking at things. And there's a national society for African violets, and I'm thinking, who knew? So I joined, and the most tangible benefit of membership is the African Violet magazine. So I want to show it to you. This is the most recent edition. This is the May-June 2012 edition. I hope you can see that. Put it there for you. And it is an awesome magazine. This is well worth the price of membership in the society. Comes 6 times a year. It's filled with great articles, all kinds of stuff, and wonderful pictures, and you can see from the cover. And here's another page that has some color photos. You will see some really beautiful plants in this book, and magazine, I should say, and you'll learn so much. There are columns that are regular features in the magazine. There are things for beginners, for experienced growers, all kinds of information. I highly recommend joining the AVSA. On the blog for All About African Violets, you will find a link over on the sidebar that says Join the AVSA, and there is a PDF file that will open up that you can print out and fill in the information and send in to join. I believe it's $30 a year. That is a great deal to just get this magazine. It's wonderful. There are other benefits to being a member of the society as well, but the magazine is very tangible, and I think you'll enjoy it a lot. So one of the other tips I'm going to give you is that sometimes what they do here, and if you're traveling at all this summer. It is summertime, it's July 1st. They publish a vacation guide, and people can, many of our commercial growers are listed in this guide. And so if you happened to be traveling somewhere in the US where somebody is and you wanted to stop by, you can call, you can make an appointment. If you happen to be near Colfax, California, for example, you could visit Lynn Lombard at the Velvet Leaf. And if you were in Kansas, you could find Patty Daniel at Patty's Plants and Antiques. Or if you were in New Jersey, Donna Brining, Fancy Bloomers. There are all kinds of places. If you were in Canada, you could maybe visit Aka's Violet Tree in Mississauga in Ontario. So this is also a great tool that comes in the magazine. And that's about it for Tips and Treasures today. I think this podcast will probably be a little shorter than they may be as we go forward. It's my hope that we will be at about, anywhere between 40 minutes to 50 minutes, and each time it will depend. Sometimes I think when we have a special guest it may be a little bit longer, but the next section of the podcast is called What's on the Stands. So I'm going to show you some video that I shot, and you'll have to forgive me. I'm still learning about video. In fact, if you're interested, this podcast is shot on my Canon G11 camera, and it seems to be working pretty well. The first ones I shot, I actually couldn't figure out the sound part, so I sound kind of odd on them. And there is another section that will be in the basement of my home where I have leaves put down. And you'll hear there's kind of funky sound on it, so I apologize in advance for that. But so what happens on the stands? I came home, I had no plants at all. I mean, that's the first time ever. I had no gesneriads. Violets are in the gesneriid family, and I grow a couple of other gesneriads. Besides African violets, I usually grow Streptocarpus, and I usually grow some Columnia plants. But I mentioned earlier that I made a mistake, and I did. I had switched potting soil. Now, I had ramped up, as I mentioned, to hopefully have lots of plants to take to National. And I switched potting mixes last fall, and I was using a mix that I understood did not have any fertilizer added to it. I choose to grow for show. I really enjoy that. And when you grow for show, you want to have a lot of control over the amount of fertilizer your plants get and also the amount of light that they get. So I was using this mix that, as I said, I thought was going to be great. Unfortunately, it had fertilizer in it, and I didn't realize it. I didn't read the label carefully enough. I didn't ask enough questions about it. I took the word of others who had used it in the past, and I believe in the past it did not have any fertilizer in it. But things change over time, so it's important to kind of keep up with that information. So for months, my plants got double doses of fertilizer, which resulted in something called micronutrient toxicity. Say that 3 times really fast. Nothing was looking good, and as the plants that I had put on the pre-show schedule were growing, they weren't growing. They weren't growing well, and I thought this just isn't normal. This isn't what usually happens when I'm doing this. But I kept going, and as I got closer and closer to National, I thought, I'm not going to have any plants to take. They're not blooming like they should. Nothing seems to be growing well. So I took some photos and I sent them to a good friend of mine who's very knowledgeable, and she thought that it was micronutrient toxicity, and explained to me that other people had had this problem and that it doesn't really go away. Even if you were to take a leaf and put it down and grow the next generation on, the centers could still just go whack at any time. And rather than spending all that time propagating a new plant and then likely losing it, I made the decision to let them go. So I went through the stands, and I just put my show notes there so I could see them, and my iPod just shut off. Sorry, I'm getting used to this. I made the decision to get rid of them. So I had a pretty big trash bag, and about half my plants went out. I kept the ones that looked the most promising for show, but they didn't get any better. And it was just a few days before show. I tried leaching them. I tried, which is letting water run through and kind of leach out the fertilizer salts out the bottom of the pot. I tried everything I could think of. And finally, I had to take the advice that I learned initially from a book that I read years ago that I'll talk about on a future podcast, called Growing to Show by Pauline Bartholomew. I had to take the advice that I'd read there and that I myself had given to many growers. When in doubt, throw it out. I don't really think that I had mites, but there was enough question in my mind that something was going on with the plants that wasn't being corrected by anything that I was trying, that I made the decision to start over. So the night before I went to National, I was standing with a big black trash bag taking plants, and out they went, pot and all, out to the trash. So I left my house with plant stands that were dark for the first time in I don't even know how long, and I had no gesneriads at all. Well, that was something that was easily remedied, and if you have ever been to the National Convention, you'll know what I'm talking about. Because the commercial growers who are there in the sales room, boy, they bring the best of the best to National, and there are wonderful plants, there are leaves to buy, there are supplies, anything you could want, you can get there. And so I stocked back up and I shared with some friends, and so my plan was really to bring home mostly leaves. Of course, I ended up bringing home quite a few plants as well. I made the choice to take leaves from those plants and put them down to propagate. And of all the plants that I brought home, and you'll see them on the tape here in just a moment, I only kept 9. And I felt that I would keep 9, and I put a systemic in the soil that would take care of pretty much, I washed the majority of the existing soil off of their root ball and repotted them into, oh, that was a big blast of thunder. The windows were shaking. I repotted them into my own potting mix, which is a mix that I had used before. I get it from Gary Makita. He's a commercial grower in Portage, Indiana, and he calls it the Sunshine Mix. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I've had great success with it in the past, and so I switched back to that and repotted everything. Things are growing. They are taking their time. It's been very hot here this last month in Illinois. But I have some shots of that for you. The first videos that you'll see are literally taken right after I got back from National. They're taken on June 10th and June 11th. So you will see the plants in the kitchen, and then you'll see also the result of 2 days' work once I got together and got everything taken care of. So sorry, I seem to be having trouble speaking. That's a rarity for me, but I'll be right back after this. I'm just back from the National African Violet Convention. It was held this year in Detroit, Michigan. And everything you see here, it's all plants. All plants. I'll show you shortly what they look like out of the bags. A lot of plants, huh? I came home with them, and they're so beautiful when you see them like that on the kitchen bar, and all those blossoms and everything's there. Well, all that goes away. All of those blossoms go away. Any hitchhikers that might have come home on those blossoms go out in the trash. And again, as I mentioned, I took leaves of everything and put them down. So this next bit of video you will see actually the results of my 2 days of work. I'll show you first the 7 plantlets that I kept, and then the leaves that I put down in my basement. I'll be right back. Well, out of all those plants that you saw earlier, I kept 9 actual plants, and the rest I took leaves of. I'll show you those in a moment. Okay, now we're down in my basement, and this is one of the plants, one of the plant trays with leaves in it from the leaves and plants that I brought home from National. And this tray I won at National. It's actually very cool. It's much heavier plastic, and these are some more of the leaves. And it's kind of cool if you can see. It's kind of hard to see, but this is a vent that will open and close, and there are 2 of them on the tray. So these will be hanging out down here until they sprout, and we'll check in on them from time to time and see how things are going. It doesn't look like that much, does it, for all the work that I did? But I have 2 trays full of leaves, and I planted them on a fruitful day. We'll talk about planting by the phases of the moon in another episode in the coming weeks. It's something that I try to do a lot, and it works really well for me. But the next little bit that you're going to see, I'm just going to give you kind of an update on those 7 plantlets that you saw and show you how they look today. It's been about 3 weeks, and they're growing. They're taking their time, but they're growing. Well, here's a look at everything today on July 1st. These are the 9 plants that you just saw in the previous video, and you can see they're growing. They're growing slowly, but they are growing. Definitely have some stress from having been repotted and having been stripped down a lot. This is Rob's Antique Rose. I'm going to try to tilt it so you can see a little better that there's some mottling on the leaves, and there's also what looks to be like a little bit of rust. What this is fertilizer salts, and next week I'm going to show you how to get rid of those. So this was our quick update for what's on the stands for today, and I'll be right back. So what do you think? Can you see? Could you see? I mean, I can't tell yet if I could actually see the rust that I was trying to show you about, the rusty looking stuff. What that is fertilizer salts. So that's telling me, and it's very interesting to me because I'm a standard grower. African violets, as you might know, come in a variety of sizes. Standards, which are the kind you see at the Home Depot or other stores, they're a normal size looking plant. They also come in semi-miniatures and miniatures. And then they also have trailing varieties, and there are species, well, you know, it goes on and on. But I'm a standard grower. I like to grow standards. It's what I feel that I grow the best. I can grow semis usually. Minis and we don't generally speak the same language. And it's very interesting to me as I look at those 7 plantlets. There are 2 standards there, and the other 5 or other 7, I beg your pardon, are semis. Sorry, I was trying to think for a minute. Did I have 7 or did I have 9? I think I have 9. Now I'm in the sunroom. I can't go and look. But on the standard that's growing, there are no fertilizer salts crystallizing toward the crown. So that's telling me that my fertilizer mixed with the water may be a little too strong for the semis and the minis. So I'm going to look into that. I'm going to be asking a few questions of some friends of mine who actually are expert mini and semi growers, and I'll let you know what they tell me. And next week I will show you how to get some of that off, the orange off, because it's better to get rid of that sooner rather than later. And it's very easy to do, to rinse it and kind of get that out of there, and then keep moving forward. Which takes us to the next section actually of the podcast, which I'm calling Get the Bail Money Ready. Now, that's a joke in my family, so it might not be funny to you, but I'm going to explain it to you, so maybe it will be funny. In addition to growing African violets, I have a couple of other hobbies that I really love. I'm a bagpiper, and I'm learning how to play the hammer dulcimer, but I also am a fiber artist, and I've been knitting since I was a little girl. So my grandmother taught me. I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I've been knitting off and on all that time. And I love to spin. I have 2 spinning wheels. I spin my own yarn, and I'm learning to weave. I actually have 2 looms. I was gifted with a table loom this week to go with the loom I already have. So I'm really thrilled. It was a phenomenal gift from an old friend. So I rarely have met a fiber art that I don't love. And I have, as a knitter, gone on a number of knitting retreats. And one day I have a cousin who is a criminal attorney. And we're quite close. We grew up together. And I had called and left him a message and said, hey, I'm out of town. I'm going to a knitting retreat. And left him a message. And then he called back and left me a message. And it went something like this. He said, a knitting retreat? Really? He said, let me get the bail money ready. So I thought that was very funny because, knitting, bail money, it just doesn't happen very often. Although I do have a very funny story to tell you about Get the Bail Money Ready. As I mentioned, I was just at National, which was in Detroit, right there at the border, right before you go to Canada. And my GPS had me turn one street too soon. So I turned into the tunnel that takes you to Canada. And I was like, holy smokes, I don't even have my passport with me. I have family in Canada, but I'm like, I can't go to Canada. So I saw the Canadian Border Patrol on the US side, but they were right there. And I pulled over. I said, you guys, my GPS turned me in here by mistake. And I got to get turned around. I'm trying to get to this hotel. I think it's right over here. Can you help me get turned around? And the guy said, ma'am, just pull your car right over here. I'm like, okay, I can turn around and just pull your car right over here, ma'am. I'm like, all right. So I pull the car. He goes, go slowly, please. I'm like, okay. He goes, no, pull in here. I said, but I just need to turn around. He said, ma'am, park the car right here. And I'm like, what the hey, what's going on here? So I parked the car, and he said, ma'am, step out of the car. And I'm like, okay. He said, leave the keys in the car. He said, do you have anything to declare? And I said, I didn't go to Canada. I don't have any, I don't want to go to Canada. I said, he just made the wrong turn. And I said, no, I don't. I said, did I get to Canada and not know it? And then he said, do you have any weapons in the car? I'm like, no, I don't have any weapons in the car. Then I'm thinking to myself, what is going on here? And so he looks at me again, and then I can see him kind of look in the back seat of my car. And he says, are you sure you don't have anything to declare? And I look in the back seat, and I go, oh, I said, that is potting mix. That's for a friend of mine. I'm trying to go to the African Violet Convention. It's here at this hotel. The guy's looking at me like I'm crazy. All right. And I have hefty Ziploc bags of dirt in the back of my car because the potting mix that did not work for me actually works really well for a friend of mine. And I was bringing the rest of what I had to her. And I said, it's dirt. It's just dirt. I had, so they bring the dog out, and they put the dog in my car, and he leaps into the front seat, and he's smelling something in the front seat, and they keep trying to get him to go into the back seat. And of course, it's just dirt, so he's not really interested in the back seat. And I'm like, all there is, I said, there's some leftover pretzels and an empty box of dots. I mean, he can have the pretzels. I'm done with them. And the guy's like, no, and he's trying to get him to go in the back seat. Then he says to me, okay, ma'am, you're going to have to go inside. And I'm like, oh my God, what's happening? And then I'm like, I'm getting arrested. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I am going to have to get the bail money ready. I'm going to have to call my cousin and hope that he knows an attorney in Detroit. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? So this one guy walks me inside, and I sit down, and I'm sitting there, and I have my purse with me, and that's all I have. And I'm sitting there, so there's a guard like right next to me, and I look at him and I go, can I use my cell phone in here? And he says, no ma'am, not until an officer speaks with you. And I was like, oh, all right. And all these guys are behind the desk, and they're all looking at me like, what are you doing? You know? And I'm just sitting there, and then I look in my purse anyway, and I'm like, so I look back at the guard, and I said, well, you know, I can't use it anyway because it's in the car. He just looks at me, and I'm sitting there, and I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, I'm going to jail. I'm going to jail for bags full of potting mix. What am I going to do? And I'm thinking, bail money. What am I going to do? Bail money. Finally, I mean, they come back in, and of course, there's nothing in my car. So he said, fine, ma'am, you can go. Your car's right outside. I'm like, okay, thanks. Nobody escorts me back to my car. They just go, you can go. Well, I get back to the car, and they had torn my car apart. They said the dog alerted on something in the front seat, and I pretty much think that it was old potpourri I've had in the car for as long as I've had it, and the car's like 11 years old, so it's really old. It doesn't even smell good anymore. But anyway, that was my story on trying to get to National this year and thinking I really was going to have bail money. But I did have to put my whole car back together. They had flipped the seats down and the stuff up, and they'd opened all my bags, and some of them were still open, and it was quite an ordeal. Normally, it's not that wild going to the National Convention, but I still call it Get the Bail Money Ready. In the coming weeks, there will be a show. The Illinois State Show will be happening at the end of July, and I will have more information for you on that in the coming weeks before the show. Which leads us to the last section of the podcast, and I call it Keep Moving Forward. There's plenty to do with African violets, but we all have plenty of other things in our lives as well. So I want you to know, though, that if you have questions about growing, about anything about violets that I can help you with, please go to the blog at allaboutafricanviolets.com and leave a comment there, and leave me your questions, and if I don't know the answer, I will know someone who does know the answer, and I will be able to read some of those on the next podcast and the podcast going forward. So please always feel free to leave me your comments there and any questions that you might have. The podcast will be available on Blip TV and also downloadable from iTunes. And I hope that if you like it, you will leave star ratings on iTunes. That's very helpful for me as a podcaster, and it makes the podcast more visible to other people. Speaking of which, I hope that you'll tell your friends to tune in every week and enjoy the podcast along with you, and I hope that you will come back next week and that I will see you then. I hope that your day is filled with all the things you love. Good growing. See you next time.